So let's start, if we could, on what I might call the macro crisis. And Anatol, I wonder if you can just start us off. Had we not solved the problem of depressions, are we not now living in something that feels a bit like a depression? It's certainly comparable to the 30s. And what went wrong there?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, we did solve it. I think in your introduction you said Keynes and his followers believed that the problem had been solved. And I think they're right. The trouble is that, of course, the solutions have not been implemented. Keynes said, actually, at the time of the Second World War, he was a very disillusioned man because actually the only country that implemented his ideas in full in the 1930s in Europe was Nazi Germany. And he actually said, I now realize that although my analysis is correct, this is broadly what he said, democratic governments will never have the decisiveness to implement my recommendations except in times of warfare, which is exactly what happened. The Second World War broke out. Governments started spending as if literally there was no tomorrow. They started printing money, and lo and behold, full employment was returned. So I think in that sense, it's a fairly simple answer. And the only thing I'd add is that right now, there is a very interesting controlled experiment going on in the world between this country and the United States. And basically the United States rather feebly is implementing a Keynesian policy and has been for the last 3 years. Britain was for a couple of years after the crisis, but then abruptly changed in early 2010 for reasons we all know, political reasons we all know. So for the last year and a half, Britain and America have been trying opposite policy prescriptions for the same crisis. And I think over the next year, we're going to find out which is right. The indication so far is that the American economy now is recovering, and personally I think will be in an all-out boom by the end of this year, and we're not. So I think in a year's time, come back, and I think we'll know the answer.
And you're measuring success by the first-year effect of the stimulus policy as opposed to the 10-year effect when they're paying back or whatever the extra debt. Stephen.
Yes, I wanted to kick off with just an observation about this comparison with the Depression. The Depression was far worse than anything we've so far been through. I mean, I say so far because things might get far worse. But US national income fell by 30% from peak to trough, a total, utter collapse, the kind we haven't seen this time around. US male unemployment rose to about 25% of the workforce in the 1930s. Again, we haven't seen anything quite like that. I think policies have worked extremely well to prevent that from happening. There was massive stimulus, both in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. The problem has been that we've avoided something we thought we were never going to be suffering from, and we haven't avoided something we thought we could avoid. The thing that people thought we could avoid was a Japan-style stagnation. Japan has stagnated over the last 20 years. Most Western policymakers thought that they knew why Japan had stagnated, a failure to use macro policy sufficiently well. And the consequence was that we thought we could prevent a Japan-type situation. What we've actually done is prevented a depression, but we seem to have ended up with something which looks uncannily like Japan. Stagnation, lack of growth, very high levels of debt, deleveraging continuing to take place all the time. And we've got to the point now where interest rates are incredibly low, fiscal policy not really offering much in the way of stimulus, and maybe we just got to the point where the ammunition effectively has run out. So we've done something good, but it hasn't been good enough to return to us to conditions as were the case prior to the crisis.
Just clarify where you are on austerity. I mean, so essentially Anatol says, we know the solution, we just aren't doing it. Is that your view?
Well, I think the US is lucky. The US is lucky because it has the world's reserve currency. It's very easy for the US to borrow from the rest of the world very easily in the way that it's very difficult for, say, Greece or Spain or Portugal to borrow from the rest of the world. So there's a big difference in terms of the US creditor or debtor position. So from that point of view, I think that the US can get away with things that others can't get away with. But at the same time, if you look at the levels of government debt as a share of national income, both in the States and across Europe, you find there's been only 3 occasions previously over the last 100 years where government debt has been this high. Immediately after the First World War, where some countries dealt with that through hyperinflation, which is a pretty nasty experience. In the middle of the depression in the 1930s, where you had a situation where income basically collapsed and governments defaulted. And immediately after the Second World War, where actually things worked out pretty well. But that's because we found a source of growth. Growth didn't come from fiscal stimulus and monetary stimulus. It came from the opening up of trade opportunities, the removal of all the protectionism that was in place in the first half of the 20th century. And the problem is that we've exploited those opportunities now, and we're now left with something much more difficult, which is basically stagnation.
Linda, you're a notable you wrote the textbook, Macroeconomics, or co-wrote the textbook. Where do you stand on the macroeconomic pickle we're in?
I agree with what's being said so far in that I think the difficulty for the British economy and for quite a lot of governments which don't issue the world's reserve currency is that the only way to get your debt to a sustainable level is somehow your economy is growing faster than the rate of growth of your debt. And how fast your debt grows depends on the borrowing cost, the interest rate that you pay on that debt. So if you issue the world's reserve currency, then you benefit from having, well, low borrowing costs, as the United States does. But for other countries, there's always a danger that borrowing costs could shoot up because the country could be viewed as not being credible and bringing down their debt over time. And given the slow rate of growth in Britain, which is very common after a financial crisis, then the worry is that our economy is extremely slowly growing, and should borrowing costs shoot up, it could make it quite untenable. And I think that's where the reality of markets plays into the theory of austerity and debt sustainability. And let me just make a caveat. My textbook may be the recommended text for the Government Economic Service, but I cannot vouch that anybody has actually read it in the Government Economic Service.
Gideon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the debate so far has posed the question quite nicely. Are we more like the US, in which case we've got all this latitude that Anatole thinks we're not exploiting, or should we be really worrying about being more like Greece and Spain and Italy, in which case Osborne's absolutely right, and we've really got to get control of the debt, otherwise we're going to be caught in the kind of nightmarish situation where we can't service our debt and we have to cut in the very, very uncontrolled way that they're doing and get into this downward spiral. My suspicion is that we're probably halfway in between, which is why it's a difficult dilemma. We've got some of the historic credibility that the US has. We know we haven't defaulted on our debt for many, many years, so there may be some sort of latitude there. On the other hand, we don't issue the world's reserve currency, and I do think there's a danger. There was a bit of crowing in Britain when France lost its AAA status. I think that could happen to Britain within the next year or so. And just a final thought on the US. I mean, it is true that they have this great advantage of having the world's reserve currency, which does give them more latitude. But I wonder whether in the end it's actually could be a source of damage to them, because it allows them to continue with potentially unsustainable policies for even longer. It's a bit like an athlete who gets a pain-killing injection, so it allows them to play on the field for longer, but they actually damage themselves as they do it. And I think that there may be an element of that with the United States.
Anatole, I want to just push you a bit, because actually the really interesting difference between the US and the UK is not just that they have a reserve currency so they can rely on the markets more than us. It's that they have a closed economy, and virtually all the economic models out there will tell you that an extra $10 billion or pounds of borrowing in the US generates about 12 billion, 15 billion of extra national income. All those models tell you in the UK, if we spent and borrowed 10 billion more, we'd get 3 to 5 billion pounds of extra national income. Now, that's not a lot, really, is it? You're stacking up a lot of debt for a tiny bit of extra income.
I think you've cornered me. I think that's the right question. I think the reserve currency issue is complete red herrings. So to get back onto my territory, it's completely irrelevant in the sense that this idea that America has some big advantage because the dollar is just doesn't hold true. Look around the world. Japan hasn't got a reserve currency. Australia hasn't got a reserve currency. Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, they all have no problem borrowing at all. The the point is that the key difference between Greece and all these is that they have a control over their own currency. They have their own central bank. We have the Bank of England. If the government can't borrow from the markets, it just turns to the Bank of England, and the Bank of England prints the money. So the only thing that restrains government borrowing is not the reserve currency, it's the fear of inflation. Right, so I think the reserve currency argument is not valid. I think Evan's argument about we are more dependent on trade clearly is valid, but trade is 30% at most of the British economy. It's true it's only about 12% of the US. So we only have half their freedom of maneuver.
Yeah. So
and I would agree that it wouldn't work as well. Yeah.
To explain to the audience,
Yeah.
it means that every pound we inject, half of it just drifts overseas.
Well,
and
more
gets
like a
spent on
third,
jet.
I would say.
But the multipliers are very, very small.
Yeah. And it does depend a lot on how you spend the money. So I think arguably the best way to spend the money, if you want to stimulate the economy, is actually for the government to spend it on domestic activities, building roads, digging roads, something that employs British workers directly. The counter-argument, which I must say I'm quite sympathetic to, is that although it's true that that stimulates the economy more directly, it also tends to be a more wasteful kind of spending and a form of spending that can't be turned off once the economy revives. So the opposite point of view is don't spend money, don't spend extra money through the government, cut taxes, give people more spending power, but that is subject to Evan's objection that if I give you each £100 of spending power, you would probably spend at least £30 of it on foreign goods.
Right. Anyone else on the panel want to come in on this? I mean,
I'll tell you, I think we've got... I think there's a fundamental question which people ought to argue or ought to answer, which is how we got into this mess. And unfortunately, the reason, in my opinion, I'm not an economist, so almost certainly all these clever people will disagree with me, is that the democratic societies in Europe and the United States, and elsewhere as well to some extent, promised people far more than they were producing, and hence colossal trade imbalances occurred. That didn't apply in China, where they don't bother about public opinion so much. And they were the reciprocal of those imbalances. And whenever you see, this is going to be contradicted by all these economists, whenever you see trade imbalances persisting on an absolutely enormous scale, you know perfectly well that the deficit countries are overspending. And that's where the trouble comes from, and we've got to correct it. And we've got to correct it particularly in the UK, where we have this ghastly debt overhang by a government, the last government. The Prime Minister enriched himself but impoverished the rest of us.
Right. We'll take John and then Thomas. Thank you so much.
I think there's a significant element of truth in what Martin has just said. And in fact, I think if we go over the various contributions we've heard and pick elements out of it, we can come up with an eclectic story that defines the predicament we're now in. I think Anatole is right. We know how to fix these problems in the sense that if we had gone into the present crisis with well-managed domestic finances and an under-control banking system, we could have responded with Keynesian remedies and we would have emerged from it relatively well. And Anatole has described correctly the sort of thing we ought to be doing. It's construction which is most hit in almost any downturn, and it's construction which is the mechanism for getting you out of it. We ought to be building more houses, not less. We haven't built enough houses for a long time. And we ought to be doing small-scale projects that have been neglected for 2 decades, through 3 decades, in fact. It's the 1 mile of extra dualling on the A21, which has not been done for 20 years. It's a whole series of small-scale projects like that. That's where our public expenditure ought to be directed. We have some scope to do that, but not very much. And the reason we don't have scope to do that is firstly that we went into this recession with public finances that had been wildly imprudently managed for 6 or 7 years, whatever reputation Mr. Brown managed to retain from his early years as he became more and more irresponsible in his later years. And we had a banking system which imploded more than the banking system of any other major country at the time. And that's why it's very difficult for us to manage the financial consequences, as Stephen has been saying, of the kind of Keynesian policies which Anatole has correctly said are known to be the right ways of dealing with this kind of situation.
That was a very good synthesis and a very agreeable consensus building. And Thomas, I'd like to get the history, the historian perspective.
It's not the historian's perspective. It's like the troublemaker's perspective. And by the way, thanks for inviting me here. It's a great honor. And what I write about is the American right, the political right in America. And when I hear your description of Britain choosing one path and America choosing the other, I'm like, what? I don't know what America you're talking about. I mean, I know. I'm sorry. I'm giving you a hard time, and I don't mean to, because I know President Obama got this enormous stimulus package passed when he was first elected, and that was really wonderful. And and the economy in America, in the United States, might well turn around. But when we talk about why depressions are awful and why we should dread deep recessions, there's two different schools of thought. One is people who don't like the idea of breadlines, okay, and who don't want to be poor, and the other is people who don't want to be regulated, okay. And there's a lot of people in America who look back to the 1930s and the disaster that they remember from the last go-around is that's when they got things like organized labor. That's when they got things like the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's when they got the Roosevelt administration. And that's what they dread. And here's the really creepy thing that I'm here to report on, to tell you about, is that the sort of populist language that you would associate with, someone like Franklin Roosevelt or something like the 1930s is almost entirely nowadays on the other side in America, is demanding austerity, demanding that we follow something like what you guys have been doing over here, and is even... Do y'all remember Herbert Hoover's term for Andrew Mellon? You know who Andrew Mellon was? He was the Secretary of the Treasury in the United States when the Great Depression started, and his genius solution for everything was to let everyone fail. Liquidate. What did he say? The famous passage: liquidate the bankers, liquidate labor, liquidate the farmer. Basically, let everybody go down. Let them all go to hell. Right? And he was Herbert Hoover's Treasury Secretary, and Hoover was not a great president, but he was smart enough to know not to do that, right? Well, get this. This is the funny thing. Today's sort of the big the movement out in the streets in America today is demanding that we do what Mellon wanted. Let everyone go down. Watch the Republican presidential debates that are going on right now. You'll see this character Ron Paul. He loves that term, liquidate. You have to let it liquidate, If you look at the famous rant, the CNBC rant that launched the Tea Party movement. I know I'm talking about something that you aren't familiar with here, but basically what started this populist movement in America was a demand that that people need to fail, losers need to lose. Okay? It's a moral argument. Winners need to win, losers need to lose. Losers need to be punished, and we know who they are. Right? And they need to go down. We need to let the economy take its moral course, which is smiting these people. Okay? That's what's... And yes, I know President Obama hasn't done any of that, and he's the president, and he's ultimately who calls the shots. But these are the people who brought about this disastrous showdown in America over the debt ceiling a few months ago and managed to wreck our credit rating.
Thank you very much, Thomas. That was very interesting. I'm going to ask Diane one question, which is, we've sort of heard how the technology that we have at our disposal has got us into Japan. We've turned into Japan. Stagnation. I just want to ask Diane, before I throw for a few questions, is that really such a crisis? Japan's not that bad? Does anybody really think that's kind of a crisis? Quick reflection, Diane, and then we'll open to the floor.
It's been very interesting listening to these comments. There's an old joke that there are three kinds of economists, those who can add up and those who can't. Actually, there are two kinds of economists. There are the macroeconomists and the microeconomists, and I do the micro kind, which is all about how businesses take decisions to invest and produce new technologies, and how consumers make their choices. And I actually think that if you look at the record of macroeconomists before 2008, it's a little bit unseemly of them to claim to know what's going on now. And the intellectual failure of macroeconomics beforehand should make us a bit more modest about the claims we make to understand what's going on now. But the lesson from Japan, I think, and actually from history as well, there's a terrific book by Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff about the history of debt crises. And I think it shows very clearly that even if you have a structural budget deficit and you've got to address that because the government can't forever carry on spending more than it takes in revenues, the way you get out of debt crises is either you have an inflation which is socially disruptive and unfair to little people whose earnings don't keep up and who only have a little bit of savings, or you grow out of it. And the growth bit is the important bit, and that's all about the microeconomics. And is there competition? Actually, can firms that aren't doing very well fail and go out of business so that new ones can come in and do new inventions get made? So Japan is a very, very prosperous society, to get back to your question, but they're not doing any growing and inventing anymore, and they've got an ageing population, and they've not got any way to get out of what they're in.
Right. So in that regard, it's not going well. What I just want to do is have a quick show of hands. Quick show of hands. How many of you would say you, by and large, agree with the proposition that Anatole started with, that essentially we could make this much better if we abandoned or loosened the plan A, which the Chancellor is following? How many of you would say you agree effectively with the sort of Anatole, we should spend and borrow more as government? Should spend and borrow more. How many of you would say you'd be kind of behind George Osborne Plan A and austerity as it is currently practiced in the UK? Okay, so I'd say probably 2/3, 1/3 of those. Right, let's take a few questions. We've got some mics roving around. There's a gentleman there. Let's take just a couple of points. I want to move on very quickly to the next speaker. Yes, the gentleman there.
Hi. Actually, I just thought the question you just asked us was conflicted with the point you made earlier about open and closed economies. And surely the problem we have in Europe is that for any individual government, because you're faced with an open economy, cutting spending is the rational thing to do, because that's it's an open economy. And yet, if everybody does it simultaneously, which is what's happening in Europe now, you have this sort of grand crash across the throughout the continent. So the problem is that coordination problem between governments.
It's a collective action problem that actually makes sense for all governments to spend, because then our imports would help other countries, and then I think that's a very good point. I'm not even going to put it to the panel. It's so good. We don't need to get them to correct it. Yes, up at the top we've got somebody. Yes. Have we?
Yes, just a question about the solution for debt problem is the idea of the year of Jubilee, where debt is cancelled. Now, this was tried out in Nazi Germany in the 30s when there was a depression, and it worked well. What do the panel think of that?
That's a very interesting one. You know the Jubilee concept. Every few years you quickly you just cancel some debts. Does someone want to answer what the downside of that is? I can do it in about a sentence, but I don't know if any you want to do it. John, tell us what the downside is.
The downside is what you're cancelling is basically people's pensions. And not only is that bad news, well, I hope for everyone in this room, actually, because I hope they will all live long enough to be potentially able to receive their pensions. And it's pretty bad news for the future as well, because nobody is going to have much enthusiasm for saving in future either.
Could I go further?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's not pensions, it's your bank account. It's the money you've got. No, but this is very important. What the government bailed out when it bailed out the banks was not the bankers, but at the margin it basically bailed out your ability to take £100 out when you'd put £100 in the bank rather than take £50 out. That's what it's all about.
That is for every loan, there's someone who's actually lent the money. So let's take the one over here. I'm rushing through it because I want to move on.
Yes, Mr. Franks, I think unfairly caricatured the US right. There's a perfectly respectable school of Austrian economics, and in actual fact, the Austrian economists were the only people to consistently predict the financial crisis, and you're welcome to consult clips like Peter Schiff was right, where you can see continuous interviews explaining why the easy credit was leading to a financial crisis. Commentators like Anatol Ikoletsky and Paul Krugman, one of the beauties of their columns is that there is a weekly record of what they said and their views on everything. And if you look back to 2005, 2006, you do not see any foretelling of the coming crisis. Yet the Austrians aren't being consulted. I don't think there's an Austrian economist on this panel, despite the fact that they predicted the crisis. So why should we listen to the same people that said everything was wonderful to guide us out of our current predicament? I think it's crazy.
A round of applause for the gold standard. That's right, folks. So, look, the reason the Austrians got it right is because they're constantly saying we're heading for disaster. They say it all the time, And you know what they've been saying for the last 3 years? We're heading for hyperinflation in America. It hasn't happened, folks. They've been saying that these are the people that are. I mean, this is what the Tea Party movement is all about. Let me just. God, what else was I going to say about these people?
I don't know.
Look, I know they're friends of mine who were. Jamie Galbraith was talking about the disaster that was coming. He's not an Austrian. Yeah. Dean Baker, famous. He's not a famous economist. But he was talking about what was coming. These are. But
even Paul Krugman had lots of reservations about.
That's right, but these people were. Look, there is something about times of economic distress where orthodoxy gets smashed, and orthodoxy deserves to be smashed. And I say that as a graduate of the University of Chicago, and these people, they deserve what's discredit the sort of mainstream economic orthodoxy. Just as they did in the 1930s. What's very curious to me is that what's happening, what you see now in America, is rather than people turning to sort of the Galbraithian tradition or the sort of traditional economics of the left in America, they're turning to the sort of Ron Paul, gold standard kind of thing, and it's fascinating to me. Well, anyhow, we can talk about that some other time.
We can talk about it a lot. I'm going to close down the discussion of the macroeconomics at that point.